On a freezing night in a quiet Montana town, two small children stood alone in the snow, shivering outside a house that should have protected them. No jackets, no light, no place to go. But then, something incredible happened. A former Marine, walking home with his loyal German shepherd, spotted them in the darkness. And the moment their eyes met, everything began to change. What followed next feels less like coincidence and more like one of those quiet miracles God sends when hope seems lost. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? If you enjoy stories of kindness, faith, and second chances, please consider subscribing. In the small Montana town of Clearwater Ridge, the late autumn cold had settled heavily over the streets, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the distant echo of wind scraping against old roofs. The sun had disappeared early behind the jagged silhouette of the Bitterroot Mountains, leaving behind a pale silver sky that warned of an approaching frost. Houses sat close together, their chimneys releasing thin trails of smoke. But despite the town's quiet beauty, the night felt unforgiving. The streets were nearly empty, and the few porch lights flickered softly like weak lanterns resisting the chill. It was the kind of weather that could cut through any fabric, the kind that made people hurry indoors. Everyone except two small children standing in the cold. The older child, a thin 10-year-old boy wearing a worn yellow t-shirt under a frayed hoodie, stood stiffly beside his sister. His dark brown hair was messy, strands sticking to his forehead, and his deep hazel eyes carried a mixture of fear and forced courage. His jeans were old and too large, hanging awkwardly around his slender legs. The girl, only 7, had tangled sandy blonde hair and pale skin that looked even paler under the porch light. She wore an oversized beige jacket over her torn green shirt, clutching it closed with trembling fingers. Her blue eyes were wet, not yet spilling tears, as though she was trying to stay brave for her brother. Behind them stood their stepfather, Mark Henderson, leaning unsteadily against the doorframe. Mark was in his late 40s, with a thick build gone soft from years of drinking. His once brown hair was now dull and streaked with gray, and stubble covered his jaw unevenly. His face held the roughness of someone who had worked hard in his youth, but let himself sink into resentment and alcohol after tragedy. Lines cut deep across his forehead, but deeper still was the bitterness that shaped every expression. He had never been a kind man, but since the children's mother, Anna, passed away only months ago, he had become someone entirely different. Meaner, colder, louder. The grief he never dealt with had twisted into anger, and the two children became the targets of every outburst. Inside the house that once felt warm and full of laughter, now lingered only the stale smell of spilled liquor. Mark's voice slurred as he waved an unsteady hand. "Get out. You two do nothing but eat and breathe for free. I'm done with this." His breath carried the sharp sting of whiskey, and his eyes were red, unfocused. The boy stepped forward slightly, trying to shield his sister, but his small frame did little to block Mark's imposing presence. The girl pressed herself closer to her brother, shaking in the cold. They had nowhere else to go. Every relative lived far away, and their mother's friends were people they barely remembered. For days they had sensed this moment coming. Mark's anger had grown, and the house no longer felt like a home. But knowing it didn't soften the blow. Mark grabbed the boy's shoulder, shoving him toward the icy yard. "Out! Both of you! Now!" His words were not loud, but they carried a cruelty sharpened by grief and alcohol. When the boy stumbled, the girl reached for him, and the two clung together, stepping into the freezing night as the door slammed behind them. The cold hit them instantly. Their breath turned into small clouds as they huddled against the side of the house, trying to stay warm against the wind that whipped through the yard. The boy wrapped his arm around his sister, whispering something soft and shaky, but it did little to ease the fear in her eyes. A moment later, footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, steady and calm, so different from the chaos behind them. A tall man approached, wearing a dark field jacket layered over a flannel shirt. His strong build and measured stride carried the unmistakable presence of someone with military discipline. This was John Miller, a 45-year-old former U.S. Marine Corps veteran. His height alone made him stand out, but it was his weathered face, defined jawline, and the small scar cutting across his right eyebrow that marked him as someone who had seen loss and survived it. His short, dark brown hair had strands of gray, and his neatly trimmed beard framed deep-set blue eyes that usually held a quiet calm, but now widened with shock as he witnessed the children trembling against the cold wall. John had always been a reserved man, shaped by the weight of past missions and the burden of comrades he couldn't save. After returning to Clearwater Ridge, he chose a quieter life, helping neighbors and working odd jobs that allowed him to stay busy without engaging too deeply with the world. But despite his desire for peace, he still carried a deep sense of responsibility, especially for people he cared about. And the children's mother, Anna, had been more than a childhood friend. She had been the one person who always believed in him, even during the darkest years of his service. Seeing her children like this hit him like a punch. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Hey," he said gently, his voice low but steady. "Are you two okay?" The boy tightened his hold around his sister. Neither of them spoke. Then Mark's voice erupted again from the porch. "They're fine. They're not my problem anymore." He staggered out the door, face twisted with irritation. Under the porch light, John could see the harshness in Mark's expression, the flushed cheeks, the tense jaw of a man drowning in rage and self-pity. John stepped between Mark and the children. "Mark," he said calmly, though his posture became firm. "It's freezing. They can't stay out here." "They're not staying in my house," Mark snapped. "I'm done feeding them. Their mom left everything to them and left me with nothing. Let someone else deal with them." John's eyes hardened. "If you can't take care of them, then let me." Mark scoffed, waving dismissively. "Fine. Take them. Take all the problems with them. Just get out of here." John turned to the children, softening his voice again. "Come with me. You're safe now." He kneeled to meet their eyes, letting them see sincerity rather than force. Hesitant, trembling, they each reached for his hands. He wrapped an arm around both of them and guided them away from the cold house that no longer felt like home. Under the pale glow of streetlights, the three figures walked into the night, toward warmth, safety, and the beginning of a life none of them knew was waiting. John guided the children along the narrow gravel path, leading to his cabin on the edge of Clearwater Ridge, where the dense pine forest began to swallow the town's lights. The night air was sharp but quieter here, carrying the scent of fir trees and the rhythmic rustle of branches swaying gently in the cold wind. The cabin itself stood modest and sturdy, a single-story wooden structure with a deep green roof, slightly weathered by countless winters. Warm yellow light glowed from the windows, casting a soft welcome against the surrounding darkness. Yet despite the warmth ahead, the two children walked hesitantly, each step cautious, as though expecting the world to turn on them again. John slowed his pace, wanting them to feel no pressure. He understood fear. It had lived with him through every deployment, gripping him during long nights in distant deserts and mountains. His steady presence now came from experience and the quiet strength earned through hardship. When they reached the porch, he opened the door gently, letting warmth spill into the cold night. "Come in," he said softly. "No rush. Just take your time." Inside, the cabin held the scent of pine wood and faint smoke from the fireplace. The living room was simple: a battered leather couch, a bookshelf filled with old military memoirs and nature guides, and a framed photograph of his unit placed carefully on the mantel. The photo showed younger versions of John and his comrades, smiling despite exhaustion, and that reminder of loyalty and protection had shaped the way he lived after coming home. The children stepped inside slowly. The boy's hazel eyes scanned everything with defensive alertness, while the girl clung to her brother's sleeve, her breathing shallow. Then, from the hallway, a quiet clicking of claws approached. A large German shepherd emerged, his coat a blend of black and tan, thick and slightly ruffled from waking up. This was Ranger, a 6-year-old dog with strong shoulders, intelligent amber eyes, and a calm expression that suggested he could sense emotions before they were spoken. Ranger had been trained originally as a service companion for veterans with trauma, but after bonding deeply with John, he became the veteran's closest friend and constant support. Ranger stood still for a moment, observing the children with gentle curiosity, not approaching too fast, not barking, not tilting his head in confusion. Instead, he walked forward slowly and lowered his head slightly, a non-threatening gesture of welcome. The girl startled at first, but froze when Ranger softly nudged his nose against her hand. Her lips trembled, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled. She knelt beside him, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck, burying her face into his thick fur. Ranger remained perfectly still, as though understanding exactly how fragile she felt. The boy, trying so hard to be strong, watched his sister and then reached out hesitantly to touch Ranger's back. When his fingers brushed the dog's coat, something in his expression cracked, and his breath grew heavier, as if years of fear and confusion were loosening all at once. John stood aside, letting Ranger take the lead. The dog had a way of reaching hearts faster than any words. After a moment, John knelt beside the children. "You're safe here," he said gently, his voice warm but not overwhelming. "Nothing bad is going to happen to you again." He led them to the small dining table, placing warm cocoa in front of them. The girl wrapped her hands around the cup, trying to absorb the heat. The boy kept glancing at the door, as though afraid Mark might appear at any second. John noticed and sat across from them with a calm posture. "He won't come here," John reassured. "You're under my roof now. Ranger and I will keep you safe." Ranger settled beside the girl's chair, his large body acting like a living wall between her and the rest of the world. Every few minutes, he nudged her elbow or rested his head on her lap, grounding her emotions. The boy, still wary, watched how Ranger behaved. No sudden movements, no signs of impatience, only the steady loyalty that German shepherds were known for. Later that night, after John showed them to the small guest room, Ranger trotted in first as if inspecting it for danger. The room held a bunk bed, soft blankets, and a small lamp shaped like a lantern. For children who had lived weeks in fear, the simple coziness felt unreal. John handed them each a pair of warm socks. "You can sleep here," he said. "If you need anything, I'm right in the next room." As John stepped back into the hallway, He watched Ranger circle the floor once before lying down right at the room's threshold. His ears relaxed, but one eye stayed half open, always alert. A guardian on duty. The girl crawled into the lower bunk and immediately reached her hand down to rest on Ranger's back. The boy lay stiffly on the top bunk, but his eyes softened when he saw Ranger refusing to leave the doorway. Hours passed quietly, and when the fire in the living room burned low, John checked on them one last time. Ranger hadn't moved a muscle except to lift his head slightly when John approached. The boy had one hand dangling off the top bunk, fingers touching Ranger's shoulder. The girl slept with her face buried in her pillow, her small hand still resting on the dog's fur. John exhaled slowly, grateful for the first moment of peace the children had experienced in a long time. For the next few days, Ranger continued to bridge the fragile trust between the children and their new environment. He brought his worn rubber ball to the girl and dropped it gently in her lap, wagging his tail with patient excitement. She didn't know how to play yet, but she smiled softly. The boy, still cautious, watched how Ranger positioned himself beside him during meals or sat silently outside his bedroom door at night, like a sentinel who never questioned his duty. Slowly but surely, the walls around their hearts began to weaken. What fear had built, Ranger began to dismantle with warmth, patience, and a loyalty deeper than words. Morning light slipped through the tall pine trees surrounding John's cabin, casting narrow beams across the wooden floorboards. The children were still asleep, curled under thick blankets, while Ranger lay protectively at the doorway with his head resting on his paws. John moved quietly through the living room, his expression set in a firm, contemplative calm. The previous night had given the children a sliver of safety, but safety alone was not enough, not when everything that should have belonged to them was in the hands of a man who had abused that responsibility. John sat at the kitchen table, spreading out documents he had taken from the box stored in his closet. The box held paperwork from Anna, collected over years. Property deeds, insurance forms, old letters, and handwritten notes she had left him for emergencies. Anna had always been organized, and that trait seemed to reach beyond her passing. John's hand lingered on a photograph tucked inside, a picture of Anna smiling under the Montana sunset, her warm brown eyes reflecting kindness. Her long chestnut hair had always framed her gentle, oval-shaped face, and her soft nature made her loved by everyone in town. Losing her so suddenly had left an unfillable silence. John clenched the photo, feeling the weight of responsibility deepen. "I'll make this right," he murmured. After scanning through the documents, a sense of unease settled in. Something didn't align. Mark had no legal right to claim ownership of Anna's house or her savings. John knew the law well enough to recognize such discrepancies, but he needed someone skilled, sharp, and unwavering, someone he trusted, and there was only one person he could think of. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The call connected after a few rings. A deep voice answered, steady but slightly worn. "John? It's been a long time." John exhaled. "David, I need your help." David Hawkins, a seasoned attorney now living in the nearby city of Helena, was a man impossible to forget. In his early 50s, David carried a presence shaped by both intellect and experience. He had a tall, lean frame, sharp cheekbones, and a square jaw softened only by the streaks of gray at his temples. His once black hair had faded into salt and pepper tones, and his neatly trimmed beard framed a face marked by years of responsibility. His dark eyes were observant, always calculating, yet capable of deep warmth when speaking to people he cared about. David had an unwavering moral compass, built partly from witnessing injustice during their deployment in Afghanistan, where John had once saved his life during an ambush that could have ended everything. The debt David felt from that moment had never left him. John explained everything: the children, Mark's abuse, the property issues. Silence followed on the line before David spoke with firm resolve. Anna deserved better than this, and her kids deserve justice. John, this is the moment I repay what I owe you. Within hours, David drove to Clearwater Ridge, arriving in the early afternoon. His silver sedan rolled onto the gravel path, and he stepped out wearing a long gray overcoat over a tailored suit. Though dressed formally, his movements were relaxed, confident, and purposeful. John met him at the porch while Ranger watched calmly from behind, tail thumping once in greeting. "You look the same," David said with a faint grin. "You look more like a senator," John replied. "Comes with the job," David chuckled. Inside the cabin, David removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves. He studied all of Anna's documents carefully, his brows furrowing in concentration. "The deed clearly states the property was transferred solely to her children," he said, tapping the page. "Mark was never listed as a beneficiary. And this signature," he pointed to a scribbled name on a financial withdrawal slip. "That's not Anna's handwriting." David opened his briefcase and began stacking documents into organized piles, each labeled with a precise category: property rights, misappropriation, abuse reports, financial inconsistencies. His efficiency was almost surgical. "We'll need supporting testimonies," David said. "I can talk to some neighbors," John replied. "I'll need statements from anyone who saw Mark mistreat the kids." Just then, a soft knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. Helen Grover, one of John's neighbors. A woman in her 60s with silver-white hair pulled into a neat bun and warm hazel eyes. She carried a naturally gentle aura. Her round face and slightly hunched posture suggested a life spent caring for others. Helen spoke softly, but her voice held conviction. "John, I saw Mark yelling at the children last week, and 2 days ago I heard crying from the porch. If you need me to speak up for them, I will." David nodded respectfully. "Thank you, ma'am. Your testimony could be invaluable." Helen gave the children a reassuring smile before leaving. Her visit strengthened the momentum. By evening, David had built a preliminary case stronger than either of them had anticipated. He closed his folder and looked at John. "I'll file the petition first thing tomorrow. Mark won't be able to dodge this." John glanced toward the hallway where the children were playing quietly with Ranger. A heavy relief washed over him. For the first time since Anna's passing, there was a path forward, a chance to honor her and protect what she left behind. And with David's help, justice finally felt within reach. The courthouse of Clearwater Ridge stood at the center of town, an old brick building with tall white columns and wide stone steps polished by years of use. On this cold morning, a thin layer of frost clung to the railings, and townspeople gathered outside in heavy coats and scarves, their breaths rising in pale clouds. Word of the upcoming hearing had spread quickly. People wanted to see justice for Anna's children, and the tension in the air felt like a held breath waiting for release. Inside the courtroom, the wooden benches creaked softly as residents filled them. Shop owners, neighbors, teachers, and old friends of Anna who had watched her grow up in this very town. Near the front sat Judge Eleanor Whitaker, a woman in her mid-60s with a dignified presence. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back into a low twist, revealing a face marked by fine lines of wisdom and firmness. She had a tall, slender frame and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Known for her fairness and strict adherence to the law, she had built a reputation for being compassionate toward children and unforgiving toward dishonesty. Years of witnessing broken families had shaped her into someone who valued truth above all else. She tapped her gavel once, the solid sound echoing through the room. Court is now in session. Mark Henderson shuffled into the courtroom shortly after, dressed in a wrinkled plaid shirt and an old jacket that couldn't hide the scent of alcohol lingering faintly around him. His eyes were bloodshot, and the stubble on his jaw was uneven, giving him a disheveled, unsteady look. He tried to appear composed, but his clenched fists and jittery posture betrayed a simmering frustration. He sat down beside his court-appointed representative, a nervous young lawyer named Tom Barker, a thin man in his late 20s with sandy hair, pale skin, and a hesitant demeanor. Tom clearly lacked confidence, his eyes darting from Mark to the judge as if unsure how to handle the case. His soft voice and uncertain posture suggested he was overwhelmed, but committed to doing his job. David Hawkins, on the other hand, walked into the courtroom with quiet confidence. Wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a thick folder of evidence, he projected the steady professionalism earned through decades of legal battles. His salt and pepper hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him an air of authority, and his dark eyes carried the intensity of someone who intended to win, not for himself, but for justice. He nodded respectfully to the judge before taking his place. John entered next, guiding the two children to the front row. The boy stood close to John's side, still wary but far stronger than he had been days before. The girl held Ranger's leash, though the German shepherd didn't need it. He walked gently beside her, aware of her small steps. Ranger's thick black and tan coat gleamed under the soft courtroom lights, and his calm, steady posture made the children feel grounded. Some of the townspeople smiled warmly at the sight. Many knew of Ranger from John's service years and respected the loyal dog deeply. When the proceedings began, Mark's attorney cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, my client maintains that he is the legal guardian of these children and has acted within his rights." David rose immediately. "Objection. Acting within his rights does not include abuse, neglect, or misappropriation of minors' assets." Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Sustained. Mr. Barker, continue carefully." Tom swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor." David stepped forward to present his case with unwavering clarity. He laid out Anna's property deed, financial documents, and bank withdrawal slips, all highlighting Mark's unauthorized use of funds. He also presented photos of bruises on the children's arms and shoulders, taken discreetly by a concerned neighbor earlier that week. Next came the testimonies. Helen Grover was the first to approach the stand. She walked slowly, her silver hair neatly pinned, and her gentle face solemn. When she spoke, her voice trembled not from fear but from conviction. "I saw him yell at them, more than once," she said, her eyes fixed on Mark with disappointment. "The little girl was shivering outside one night while he screamed at the boy. No child should endure that." Another neighbor, Mr. Frank Lawson, took the stand as well. A broad-shouldered man in his 70s with a white mustache and tanned skin from years of working outdoors. He spoke with a deep, gravelly voice. "Saw him stumbling drunk out of the bar last week," Frank said. "He pushed the boy so hard, the kid nearly fell off the porch." As each testimony stacked against him, Mark grew increasingly agitated. His face flushed a deep red, and he muttered angrily under his breath. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, unable to contest the overwhelming evidence. Finally, Judge Whitaker leaned forward. Her voice, though calm, carried authority that rippled through the room. Given the testimonies, documented evidence, and clear signs of neglect and abuse, the court finds Mark Henderson unfit as a guardian. Mark slammed his fist on the table. "They're my kids now. I deserve that house." Judge Whitaker struck her gavel sharply. "Enough, Mr. Henderson. The property and all associated assets legally belong to the children and will be secured under state protection until the older child reaches 18. Furthermore, you are prohibited from any form of contact with them." Murmurs of relief rolled through the courtroom as Mark was escorted out, fuming and shouting incoherently. John placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. The girl pressed closer to Ranger, who lay quietly at her feet like a living shield. The weight of fear that once hung over them finally began to lift. Justice had prevailed, clear and undeniable. The first morning after the trial dawned quiet and bright over Clearwater Ridge. A soft layer of snow blanketed the ground, thin enough for patches of frozen earth to peek through, but thick enough to turn the entire landscape into a peaceful winter canvas. John's cabin looked warmer than ever against the pale scenery, smoke drifting lazily from the chimney as if the house itself were breathing out comfort. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted, not dramatically, but subtly, like a long-held tension finally easing. John stood in the kitchen, wearing a flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, the early light catching the salt and pepper edges of his short hair. He cooked breakfast with deliberate calm, flipping eggs in the skillet, while bacon sizzled beside it. His movements were quiet and steady, shaped by years of disciplined routine from his Marine days. But there was something gentler now in the way he checked the hallway every few minutes. Hope, maybe even a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. The children entered softly, still shy but far more relaxed than the night before. The boy's dark hair had been combed neatly, revealing his alert hazel eyes, and he wore a slightly oversized sweater John had found in a storage drawer. The girl followed closely, her sandy blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail by a small ribbon Helen Grover had dropped off that morning along with a bag of warm clothes. Helen, always gentle and maternal, had left quickly, not wanting to overwhelm the children, but her kindness lingered in every small detail she brought. Ranger padded into the kitchen behind the children, his large paws making barely a sound. His thick black and tan coat appeared even fluffier in the warm indoor light, and his ears perked slightly as the scent of breakfast reached him. The dog nudged the girl's hand softly before lying beside her chair, tail sweeping the floor in slow, rhythmic movements. His presence wrapped the room in reassurance. John placed plates on the table and kept his voice soft. "Eat slowly. There's plenty." The boy nodded, still careful, but the girl smiled shyly. For the first time in days, she took a bite without glancing toward the door in fear. After breakfast, the girl bundled herself into a warm coat and followed Ranger outside. The German Shepherd walked ahead with a steady, confident stride, occasionally glancing back as if guiding her on a grand expedition. She stepped through the snow carefully, leaving tiny boot prints beside Ranger's larger paw marks. She reached down to touch a branch lightly dusted with frost, marveling at how it glistened. When Ranger suddenly dropped his rubber ball in front of her, she gave a small laugh, a soft sound, but real. She threw the ball gently, and though it barely went a few feet, Ranger bounded after it with eager energy, returning proudly. Her laughter grew a little louder. Meanwhile, John and the boy worked on repairing the old wooden porch. Some porch boards had warped from years of weather, and John handed the boy small nails and guided him in, holding the pieces steady. "You've got good hands," John said, and the boy straightened with a spark of pride. Working with John gave him a sense of purpose, one he hadn't felt in a long time. The winter air was cold, but the activity, the teamwork, and the sound of Ranger playing nearby warmed him profoundly. Life began settling into gentle patterns. John cooked breakfast every day. The girl took morning walks with Ranger, who trotted proudly beside her like a steadfast guardian. The boy learned how to fix small things around the cabin: loose hinges, squeaky steps, a crooked picture frame. They had dinner together at the small round table, sharing not many words, but gradually more smiles. Some days, neighbors stopped by quietly with small gifts: gloves, blankets, homemade bread. At first, the children hid behind John when anyone knocked, but over time, they peeked out, offering shy greetings. Everyone in town knew what the children had endured, and many felt relieved knowing they were now in a safe place. At night, John read from old storybooks he found in a dusty chest. The girl curled against Ranger on the rug while the boy sat beside John on the couch, listening intently. Ranger often rested his head on the boy's knee, as if marking him as part of the pack. Slowly, laughter returned to the cabin. Not loud, not constant, but natural. Soft giggles, small jokes, and even quiet hums from the girl as she followed Ranger around. John found himself smiling more often too, not out of obligation, but from a genuine sense of connection. One evening, as John tucked the children into bed, the boy spoke hesitantly. "John, are we staying here?" John sat beside him, the lamplight warm on his weathered face. "As long as you want. You're safe, and you're welcome." The boy nodded, suppressing emotion in the way children do when they're afraid of breaking open. "Thank you," he whispered. Later that night, John stepped out onto the porch. Snowflakes drifted softly through the air, and the world felt quiet and whole. Ranger walked up beside him, sitting tall, ears forward, sensing something significant. John rested a hand on the dog's sturdy shoulder. Through the porch railing, the children's laughter echoed from the yard. They were chasing each other in the falling snow, bundled in warm coats, cheeks bright with cold. For the first time since losing their mother, they looked like children again, joyful, free, unburdened. John and Ranger stood side by side, watching them play as snowflakes settled gently on their shoulders. This was not the family John expected in life, but it was the one he had chosen, a new family built from loss, kindness, and the chance to heal. A new beginning had taken shape. A home had become whole again. And together, they stepped forward into a future finally shaped by hope. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder, bright lights, or heavenly signs. Sometimes they come quietly, through the kindness of a stranger, the loyalty of a dog, or the courage of a man who chooses to do what is right when no one else will. In this little story, John, Ranger, and the two children remind us of something deeply important. When the world feels cold, God still sends warmth through people He places in our path. A helping hand, a gentle word, a door opened at the right moment. These are miracles too. Not the kind we read in ancient books, but the kind God weaves into our everyday lives. Perhaps you have met someone like John, or maybe you have been that person for someone else. And if life feels heavy today, remember, God never forgets His children. He works quietly, but He always works. Healing, protection, and new beginnings often start with one small act of love. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it so others may feel that warmth too. Leave a comment to tell us how God has shown up in your life, sometimes in small ways, sometimes through unexpected people, sometimes through quiet miracles. And if you'd like to follow more stories of hope, healing, and grace, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring peace to your home today and always. Amen.